Hello, everyone! Welcome to the 7th episode of my Hunter's Gambit read-along. I am absolutely loving reading all of this to you. I don't have a lot of comments or questions yet, but I am hoping that you'll all have something to ask. It can be a question for me, or maybe a request for future episodes of Person Behind the Pen, or perhaps you want me to play a specific game, or just ask a specific question about writing. Anything and everything is encouraged. Questions about Richard's motivations? Heck, if you're feeling particularly gracious, you can just leave a message telling me if you're enjoying it or not. How about letting me know how or where you usually listen? Anything and everything is encouraged. There's only 2 more episodes left after this one, so time's running out. Remember to comment in the below. Even if you can't think of anything to ask, please think about liking, sharing, or subscribing if you're enjoying this read-along, or anything else I'm doing on this channel. It really helps with the YouTube algorithms, which is really the only way YouTube will know to share my novel with more people out there. Either way, let me thank you in advance for all the support you guys have given me so far. Even if my channel never grows, I won't be quitting, so there's no fear there. I am going to be here for a long time coming. Now, in Chapter 6, we saw that Kazunaha had been cleared of any wrongdoing, but when she went to the healer's home, she was told by Deckard that, for her own safety, she shouldn't return, at least until Richard had been similarly cleared of any crimes. He also asked her to really think about what she knew about the stranger that she was fighting so hard for, and whether the fight was worth it. In the end, Kazunaha took his words to heart, deciding not to give up on the stranger, but to do what she could to find out more about him, what his story was, and how he'd come to Hidan. And now, on with the story! And we're just going to pull the book up here. Perfect. Stretch to the left. Richard did, afraid that his wound would tear open again. The skin stretched, but held. The wound didn't tear or bleed. It was a small win. Good. Now to the right. Again, it felt tighter than he would have liked. Pain wasn't spiking through him, and that was a good sign. So long as it all held, he could leave the healers today. He was looking forward to being away from here. Deckard was a good man, but a little too good for Richard's liking. He reminded Richard of a few of the older men he'd known back home. Upright, with a stick named Honor shoved up their ass. A little tighter than I'd like, but still good. Stretch up, Deckard told him. Richard took a deep breath and let it out as instructed. This had been the movement that had stopped him cold the last 2 times he tried to prove that he was good enough to leave. A streak of pain ran through him as he lifted his arms above his head, but he didn't feel the skin tearing. He let out more of his breath and finished the stretch, holding for Deckard to evaluate. The healer leaned close, feeling around the injury. It hurt, but it was an achy pain, rather than the sharp tearing he'd been feeling for nearly 2 weeks now. He took a breath and lowered his arms as Deckard moved back to where he'd been sitting. He looked doubtful. You realize that you're not up for traveling, and you should be resting as much as you can. If I let you return to the inn, you will be under strict rules. No lifting or carrying anything for another week. There will be daily checkups. Here, if you want to travel, or there, if you can't. Richard held his tongue. He didn't think he'd ever been so watched in his life. Hopefully, he'd find out what he needed within the next day or so, and he'd know whether he had to run or not. He hoped he had enough time to stay and heal. Even with this healer's overbearing attitude, Richard knew he'd heal faster in a bed than he would on the road. He nodded. My plan was to stay in town for at least another week. Deckard sighed. Then be here before the noonday bell. If you aren't, I'll come to you. Come now, I'll help you carry your bags to the inn, and you can take small walks around town if you need to, but be careful. You'll tire yourself out easier than you think. Richard bit down on his tongue again. There was nothing to be gained from irritating the one man in this town who seemed to have no other goal than to see him get well enough to leave. Thank you. I'll take care of myself, and rest as much as I can for the next few days. Not a few days, Deckard said. A full week. I'd prefer to keep you here, but I'm hoping you'll be a better patient for yourself than you have been for me. Richard grinned. My parents died when I was young, and I had to learn to take care of myself. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have gotten this far on my own. He hesitated before he continued. I'm not from here, so I have to ask, is there any charge? In Giza, residents carried a card with them, given out by the government. Anybody who had a card could see a healer for no charge. If you were a foreigner or jobless, though, you had to pay, or go to the church. The church would help take care of you for free, but in return they would force you into indentured servitude until you covered the expense. Fortunately, fake cards were always available, for a price. All my costs are covered. However, it is customary to give a gift once you are well. Richard nodded. He would have to remember that for later. Do any of your townsfolk travel outside the walls? Deckard looked at him. Some. Why? Part of the reason I chose to come to Hidan was to make a little money, but I'll need a guide. Would that girl that saved me be one of them? Deckard stilled. That one has no survival instincts. If you ask around at the Koi, I'm sure you'll find someone more skilled that could aid you instead. Anything else? Richard smiled. Not right now. Good. Let's get going then. Deckard picked up Richard's backpack, and Richard put on his shoes eagerly. He couldn't wait to be out of here. The air was cold this early, but it didn't chill his lungs the way it had when he first arrived 2.5 weeks ago. He wondered again if he would ever get used to this dreaded cold. At the Lucky Koi, Deckard had arranged a room for Richard the night before, proving to him that despite Deckard's holier-than-thou attitude, he was a good guy. The bed Richard had occupied the first night had been in the common sleeping area, a room nearly 30 feet long, and the width was filled with beds with a small chest at the foot of each. The new room was less than half that size, but had a bed to itself, a small dresser beside it, and a table. It even had a lock on the door. A perfect room to rest in. He'd asked about these rooms his first day here, but they'd been having that party, and higher-ranking guests had already taken all of them. Besides, he hadn't really wanted to pay the cost. Now the ridiculous price of having a private room while he healed was a luxury he was willing to pay. As he lay down on the bed, he was glad that Deckard hadn't stayed. His side throbbed, and he was breathing heavily. He was tired and needed to rest. Irritating enough when he wanted to find out just how screwed he was. He picked up his journal and a bit of graphite. The men in the alley had attempted to kidnap him, and there were only 2 people who had any reason to want him that badly. Neither were nearby, but one had a much further reach. He shook his head. He wasn't sure that anywhere would be far enough to escape her. His breathing hitched at the thought. In his first days of freedom, he'd ran and ran, stopping only when he couldn't run anymore. Running like a rabbit wouldn't help him escape. Using his brain would. First, he would have to find out if anyone had found out who the men were. One had been a known bounty hunter, but according to the sheriff when he'd stopped by, he hadn't been carrying papers for Richard. To Richard, that was just more reason to be worried. The lady would use any tool that came her way, legal or no, and she could be persuasive in ways he didn't want to think about. He could ask about the men's equipment, to see if they had anything on them to mark them as hers. Barring that, he would need to find out if they had spoken to anyone here, and what they had talked about if they had. Fortunately, Deckard had let slip that the bounty hunter had been seen working with a criminal in a less than reputable side of town. He'd check with the underground when he got the chance. The door opened. Most town sheriffs, especially in pathetically tiny places like this, were obnoxious. Idiots, drunk on their own power. This one was no exception. "Knock, knock, bastard," the man said as he closed the door behind him. "Sheriff Dobson, I'd say it's a pleasure to see you again, but I'm a bit too tired to extend the courtesy at the moment. I know how you killed those men in cold blood. Don't think you're off the hook yet. I acted in self-defense. Richard narrowed his eyes at the familiar threat. You say that. I have a few that said you knew these fellows from a long way back. What did you steal? What were they trying to kill you for? As if he would just tell the idiot. I didn't know them, Richard said. He had faint memories of men who looked like them, but those weren't always true memories. And I didn't steal anything. The lady had let him go, had blessed him with a gift. He may have made the request without thinking about the consequences, but once offered, the gift could not be taken back. Now that he was free, there was no way he was ever going back. Sheriff Dobson snorted, and Richard bared his teeth, pointing at his bag. Look for yourself. Again. Everything I own is in that bag, and none of it has a bounty on it. That doesn't mean it isn't stolen. When he had been young, men like the sheriff, with their icy glares, would have scared Richard. However, he hadn't been a child since before his mother had died, leaving him alone on the streets of Giza. Even if it was, it wouldn't matter, Richard told the man. You need proof to throw a man in jail, not baseless accusations. If this town were one iota smaller, perhaps the man could do whatever he wanted. But it wasn't, and even Dobson had to answer to someone, as long as Deckard hadn't led him wrong telling him about Harrison. I will find something on you, Dobson spat, confirming the information. The door slammed shut behind him. Richard winced at the sound, and he put his book on the counter, leaning back against the pillows. He hadn't even left his bed, and he was already exhausted. No matter how tired he was, he couldn't sleep like this. Pushing himself up from the bed, Richard shivered. His stomach roiled as he stood, and his side ached. Pain stabbed through him. Grabbing the wall, Richard used it to get to the door. Just before he reached it, there was a knock. Richard stilled. I've got some water for you. Healer Deckard's orders. Richard moved the last few steps and opened the door. The man had short hair, nearly down to his skull. He had a tray with a jug of water and a small candle-fed cup heater. The healer said you're probably going to be wanting to take some of those herbs he left you for pain. Said you'd need hot water for it. The man put the water down and lit the candle inside. Then he filled the mug and set it on top. It takes 5 minutes to boil. If you want to drink it at a lower temperature, but still warm, that'll be 3 minutes. The candles are a silver each, but don't waste them if you don't have to. Hey, you don't look well. Let me help you sit back down. Richard shook his head. I'm going to sleep as soon as I finish this, and I'll want to lock my door. The guy looked sympathetic. No problem. Let us know when you want some dinner, okay? We'll set some of the stew and bread aside for you. Richard nodded and locked the door behind the man. Then he methodically made his way back to the bed. The water was just beginning to steam gently when he reached it. He sat and threw in one of the bags that Deckard had given him. Each bag needs to steep for at least 5 minutes, and then needs to be drunk within 20 minutes. Each bag can be used twice before it should be thrown out. No honey or sweeteners can be used with them for at least the next 4 days, he said, repeating the healer's instructions. He pulled the drink off the heater and blew out the little candle. Then he crawled into bed, hating how cold he felt, how tired. He pulled up the covers and sniffed the drink. Vile! It smelled acrid and sharp. Pinching his nose, he downed the entire cup in a single shot. He didn't taste it going down, but the stuff had an aftertaste that seemed almost sulphurous. He gagged and drank a few mouthfuls of cold water straight from the jug to clear the taste. The moment he set the jug back down, his eyes started drooping. Richard sighed in pleasure as the hot water seeped into him, reaching his aching side, warming the wound. The sharp claws forcing their way through him slowly disappeared. Richard pulled the covers up to his nose. His mother had always said that sleep was better than medicine. For now, if Deckard's potions would help him sleep without pain, he'd drink every one of them, without complaint. His last thought as he nodded off was of the girl again. Her dark eyes were all he remembered. They'd been soft and exotic, comforting him, like a symbol of his goddess. Okay, and we're just going to put the book down now. Perfect! I loved seeing where Richard's mind went this chapter. Unlike Kazunoha, Richard is always in planning mode. Technically, this makes him the more active character, which means that his viewpoint can take over if I let it. One of the rules of writing is that you want an active protagonist, but they forget to tell you that if a secondary character is much more active than your protagonist, you may need to hold them back. I'd worry more, but Kazunoha is essentially an agent of chaos, even if she is less active than Richard, which means there's always something happening around her that she needs to meet and solve. I will add that one of my favorite lines in this book is in this chapter, and I'm so glad I finally got to read it to all of you. That one is, Deckard was a good man, but a little too good for Richard's liking. He reminded Richard of a few of the older men he'd known back at home. Upright, with a stick named Honor shoved up his ass. And I think that's going to be it for this week. I'll be back on Friday with my next Person Behind the Pen episode, and a new reveal. So you'll want to make sure you get to there and take a look. Alright? Okay, bye!